Okay, are we ready to get started? It is high noon. So our usual first order of business is introductions. My name is Norton Cabell. I'm your chair.
John Van Landingham, I'm a legal aid lawyer.
Stephanie Jennings, City of Eugene staff.
Chris Pryor, City Eugene City Council.
Julia Boss, Eugene resident, renter.
Teresa Kennedy, City of Eugene staff.
Lydia Dysert, minutes reporter.
Kristen Carley, St. Vincent de Paul.
Jenna Fribley, architect and HPB member.
And out there in the public,
Ken Beeson, Planning Commission.
Richard Self with League.
Joshua Caraco, Springfield Eugene Tenant Association.
Ellen May Galloway, City of Eugene staff.
Nicole Steller, City of Eugene staff. Karen Fulner, Masters of Social Work student at Pacific University.
Michelle Stark, St. Vincent de Paul.
Claire Devereaux, U of O student.
Rick Guerra, Human Rights Commission.
Don Boyle, First SL Housing.
welcome all. So next is public comment. So I have Richard Self.
Yes, that's
Would you like to come talk to us?
yes. Just a second. All right, I just making my notes as I was approaching. I just wanted to caution the board very simply that with using such strict federal funding in the consolidated plan, that the housing proposed be income-based affordable housing or obtainable housing for those who make less than $1,000 a month, as has been proposed before to this board. There is no reason that certain people who do not make the $60,000 a year criteria should be thrown aside for this consolidated plan. The CBDG funds and home funds are, of course, Stephanie will attest, have very strict guidelines and are to be used for very low income people. So to make housing that's unobtainable to those who are on fixed incomes or are disabled, I would caution the board in the creating this consolidated plan for the next 5 years, as been told to this board before, that these be obtainable, income-based, affordable housing for everybody. Thank you.
Are we not in compliance? Okay.
We'll talk more about the consolidated plan later
When we get
on
there.
the agenda.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's good. And Joshua?
Yeah. Guess you all know me at this point. I just wanted to respond to a couple things that happened at the last meeting, because sometimes I feel like I'm about to explode in the audience and I don't get to talk, so I'll do that now. Because someone had a comment about a couple of things, and I think sometimes maybe we don't end up having the right conversations when comments are made, or at least in my opinion. So there were two comments. Nigel Mosby sat up here and made two comments that at last meeting, and one was about like neighborhoods and makeups, and one was about ADUs. And I'm not going to say what he meant by these comments because I don't know, but I can say what I got out of them that I think got kind of not talked about that could have been the right conversation. I mean, one is like, I don't know what Housing Policy Board's role in like neighborhood makeups is necessarily, but I think what I can take from a comment like that is like people of color feel uncomfortable in the city of Eugene, and that's interesting and accurate and matches a lot of figures, and then maybe as a housing policy board that could be like a fair housing issue, which Val Hoyle says is a thing. So that's a conversation you're gonna have in context there. And about ADUs, I felt I was about to explode because he made this comment, and even John at first was like, well, that doesn't have anything to do with ADUs. And then we looked it up and we discovered right there is a little exemption in SB 608 for owner-occupied and ADUs. But to me, like this isn't, the fact that there's an exemption in SB 608 for ADUs under certain conditions is not a reason to not encourage the development of ADUs. And I don't think that's what Nigel was saying. But it is an interesting conversation to have because what is codified in the law when there are exemptions like this, is that the rights is that the basic comfort of a landlord is more important than the basic stability of a tenant. And that's not an opinion, that's what we have codified in the law. That's not, so people look at me and say, you're just like a tenants' rights activist person.
Which you are. but
Which
anyway.
is true, but that's not, this is a legal definition, and when there, it does make some sense that when you share a property with some people, there is a logic to the idea that it matters more that you get along with that person. There is some logic that follows there, and that it would be easier to ask them to leave that property. There is a logic followed there that makes some sense, right? That it is that much harder. You have to get along that much better. All these issues matter that much more. Your comfort with who you're sharing property with matters more when you're actually sharing the property. Still, it is codified in the law that the comfort of the person who owns the property is more important than the basic stability of the person renting the property. And so to me, this is not a reason not to build more ADUs or loosen restrictions, but it is an important conversation to have. Because as a tenant, like activist in person or advocate or whatever the hell I am, tenants are not really asking for special treatment. They're just asking to have the same rights as everyone else. And I'm not speaking for my organization at this point or anything, that's just me, because sometimes I hear these conversations and the right conversation doesn't get had when it could. And that's what I waited a month to say.
So Josh, we're going to be talking about that in more detail at the Renters Protection Committee meeting, just as you and I discussed the other day, because that's very much something that needs to be, I think, the conversation there more than here. I mean, I think it's fine for us to hear.
Yeah, these are great, but I have elected officials at the table here.
Yeah, that's true, that's true.
And lawyers who I admire a lot, but also made comments that irritated me. Neither of whom are always at those other tables.
That's part of my job is to irritate Josh.
So thanks.
Just a note for everyone, and a remind everyone, probably you already know this, there's a famous saying about legislation being like sausage meat. You shouldn't watch it. So just because the statute says something does not mean it's the right policy. It is the statute. There are a lot of trade-offs getting from a concept to policy to a result.
Okay, and nobody else signed up. Does anybody else want to come talk to us about anything?
Todd Boyle, as usual. I discovered the Homes for Good board meetings last week and recorded one and put it on the web. Big transactions happening there, very little audience. They're selling 100 homes. This has been in the pipeline for some time now.
Years.
And I'm just getting up to speed on it. I don't understand the logic of selling 100 homes that are low-income housing and liquidating low-income housing stock, actually, and getting $25 million, that's $250,000 per house, just rough numbers, and then using that money to build 50 units at a time apartment buildings, which is the new model. Many of them are permanent supported housing with services components. So it's a big complicated thing, which I don't understand. But you end up, instead of having low-income people living in houses, they are going to be living in 400 square foot apartments that cost $250,000. And at the end of the day, there's no net increase in public housing units. There's just to me, it seems like a whole bunch of commotion, but no net increase in units. And we need to be producing units like at $50,000 per unit, because we have a 10,000 unit backlog, and we're never going to get there at 50 units apiece, once a year. The housing is disappearing faster than that. The population is increasing faster than that, and their housing units are being eliminated by the private sector. So the only arithmetic answer is to build a couple of thousand units at 100,000. And so when I asked this question at the Homes for Good, Jacob Fox said, "Yeah, that's something that's achievable. If we can get land granted for mobile home parks." I think he said mobile home park, literally did, and then just put manufactured units on there, then they could actually get there, like 50, 60, 70,000 per unit. So that's something to strive for, in my opinion. I think that's a vision. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Todd. Okay, next on the agenda is minutes approval. So I noted on page 2 under the accessory dwelling unit update paragraph, the first ADU paragraph, at the end, incentives would be talked about at the city council on February 12th. Chris, what came of that?
Find me on page.
So, under
Council
ADU
had a discussion
update.
about incentives.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, we had that conversation. We talked about what the incentives might be that could be offered. There was a list of about 5 or 6 different incentives, including reductions in SDCs, a variety of different things. We kind of wanted to get a feel for how the group felt about those incentives.
The
There wasn't
council,
really, huh? How the council felt about that. I don't think there was any real opposition. I think there were some questions about how could they be implemented, what would be the impact on the city. So we're going to be gathering some more information about what scale those could be done at, what kind of impact they might have on the city, and where we could go from there. It was really more of an initial conversation than anything we'd make a decision around. I don't think there was anything more.
I think the one other piece that came out of the conversation is a focus on affordable ADUs. So,
Yeah.
if you want to say more.
Well,
about
yeah,
that.
I mean, one of the things we wanted to do is not to try to create a situation where you can build more, but they're too expensive. It was to try to figure out what are the mechanisms where you can create these kinds of housing units, but still make them within the affordable range that people can actually buy. And so what kinds of things could you do to incentivize or to assist the construction of more affordable? Some things such as, what if you were to have a set of predetermined plans where I could just walk into the planning department and say, I'm going to take an off-the-shelf plan that could save you $6,000 in having to create plans. Or if you could get SDC waivers, or if the utility implementation costs could be reduced. I think we're really interested in looking at all of those. Some of them were probably more favorable than others, like off-the-shelf design plans. Some of them are going to be a little more controversial, like waiving fees or SDCs, because we have to figure out what the impact would be on the city. But I didn't hear any outright opposition to any of them, and together they could probably assist the affordability question. So I think we're moving along. We haven't hit any major stumbling blocks. We just need to know what the impacts are going to be.
This sounds like not going to happen quickly.
I don't think anything's going to happen real quickly, but I think it will happen in concert with the other stuff that we're doing.
Okay. The only thing I have is on page 5, and Joshua brought this up. Three from the bottom. Mr. Mosby also thought they needed more predominant neighborhoods, and that's not the right word.
Well, that's kind of the word he used. And what he was saying, neighborhoods that represent a predominant cultural
minority
or
dominant.
yeah,
Minority
predominantly a certain type of group. So a neighborhood that is predominantly
Just trying to think
a
how
certain
to word
kind of
this.
group. Yeah.
You could say more minority predominant neighborhoods.
More minority, yeah.
Yeah.
Let's try that. And that's all I have.
I had a couple. On page 2, the paragraph below the one you were just talking about, it starts with my name next to the bottom, near the bottom, inquired into if the ADU pilot, which was searching funding. We weren't really searching because we know where the funding is. We were seeking funding.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
So that may be minor, but that's how people talk about bills. On page 4, the second full paragraph, Ms. Knudsen said that Springfield was ahead of the state, blah, blah, blah. The last sentence, they would be done a full year before the state deadline
Right.
on implementation. State doesn't have to implement, local governments do.
Yep.
And then in the middle of the page, Better Housing Together had talked to City Council about following other best practices around ADUs and include a 5-year, I think, SDC waiver. You have to say what's being waived. And then the next to last paragraph starts with my name again. Second line, planning changes could be made soon. Changes on the ground would not be seen. That's enough.
Okay,
Just
Julia?
one point, The comments, it's top of page 6 from Mr. Ivy. I think it would be worth clarifying that his point was what Councilor Pryor said about it not being the job of the local government / city council to help homeowners increase the value of their house. Because essentially his remark was the opposite of what this seems to imply.
So just insert the word
Just insert the
not.
word not, about
Yes,
it
yeah.
not being
Okay.
between, after about.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Anybody else? Okay, then I will deem these approved as corrected. Items from Housing Policy Board members first. John?
Yes, I heard from Bill Van Vliet that there is a proposal for a new manufactured home park in North Eugene on 38 acres. Does that ring a bell? Can you ask planning staff?
Wow.
So that would be
That'd be
important
significant.
news. Yeah. Secondly,
And you just, all you have is proposal.
that's
It's
all I heard
on-
from Bill
on
Van Vliet was that
38
38
acres.
acres, North Eugene, a private developer was going to build a new manufactured home park. And then I was hoping we could have briefings in the future, no rush, on two things that came up recently. One is the River Road Corridor Plan and its efforts at infill housing.
Yeah.
I know that John Belcher has been very involved. He's a former planning commissioner, and he has talked about that plan as having good things for infill. And then secondly, if you saw Sunday's paper, the Human Rights Commission just issued a report influenced by my coworker Lori Hauber about how Eugene treats homelessness. And so I think it would be good.
Is her report out?
Yes. So I don't know, I mean, she's offered to give you the report, but I don't know that you want to read the whole thing. So it might be better to have her come and talk about it, or have somebody from the Human Rights Commission come and talk about it. Either or both.
Yeah, I'd like to
So
read
those
it.
are the two things. And then I was hoping, I'll leave that to you. That's it for me.
Can I
Yeah.
just mention, we have Rick Guerra, who's on the Human Rights Commission in the back, and I'm wondering if it might make sense just to kind of have, in general, a discussion about the connections of the work of the Housing Policy Board and the Human Rights Commission, as well as a discussion
Sure.
about this specific report. Would you be willing to be part of that?
Yeah, I can be part of that. I
Okay.
need to check with Joel to see if maybe he wants to be here.
Okay, and I can check with staff as well. All right, thanks.
Okay. Councilor Pryor?
I can just give you a brief update on the progress of the House Bill 2001 and 2003 recommended code advisory committee. We had a meeting last week, our third meeting, where we began to really dive into the details about what some of that model code might look like. And since the medium city code is going to be going into effect a full year before the large city code, they're focusing in on the medium city code. And the real element for that is duplexes. What should the allowance for duplexes look like? What is a duplex? What are the requirements in order to allow duplexes? What would comply with House Bill 2001 in terms of permitting duplexes? And so they had a whole series of questions with regard to what might model code need to reflect or accommodate. And the two that we really spent most time talking about, because they're probably the most controversial of all of the areas around duplexes, is one, what is the actual definition of a duplex? And does that definition allow for the addition of an ADU on a piece of property that already has a duplex? Or would an ADU be considered part of a duplex? Or is a duplex something separate and the number of dwellings on the lot wouldn't allow? And so we went around and around and around. What they're trying to get to is a definition of a duplex, and this is where I hope they're going to get to, that is unique from the definition of an ADU. So that even if they're very similar in terms of how they're built and what they look like, they're still treated as two different kinds of things for the purposes of the code. It does lead to the question of, well, then can you build a duplex and also have an ADU? And we didn't really resolve that question. It's still one to be talked about, because there's concerns about how much of the property is covered, what is the residency requirements, what could happen with utilities and other things, what would be the cost. And so there's still some questions swirling around, but my sense was that it's moving towards, we want to be able to talk about duplexes, and then ADUs can be a sidebar topic, but are not central to the definition of what a duplex is.
But the result of this could be significant.
The result of this could be very significant, because you could wind up with three instead of two dwellings on a piece of property. So they still need to work that piece of it out. Another element in the duplex conversation is if you're going to allow duplexes, or even ADUs in addition, the real question is, what is going to be the parking requirement? Because at the current time, each dwelling has to have its own on-site parking space. And so if you're going to have a duplex, that means 2 parking spaces on site. If you have a duplex and an ADU, does that mean you have 3 parking spaces? Is there some sort of an allowance for not having to have so many parking spaces? One of the things they're talking about is providing builders with a credit for making one of those parking spaces be on-street parking. So if you said, we're going to provide a space for this half of the duplex on-street, so we only have to provide 1 on-site, would that be okay? The question I had, which really didn't go over all that well, was if you're going to provide a builder with a credit for an on-street parking space, you can't guarantee that the renter will actually have that space. And so the builder gets a credit for a space that the renter may not actually be able to take advantage of. My example being the university area, where they're already, coming to blows over parking spaces. So if I'm building a duplex and one of the assigned spaces for that duplex is supposed to be an on-street parking spot, how do I guarantee on public property that I can provide that spot? So they're going to be needing to talk about that. That's why parking and number of spaces is this big issue. I'm confident that they're going to work it through because there's some good people on there, but it shows you how we're really thinking about what the on-the-ground implications are of trying to provide for duplexes, triplexes, townhouses, quads, when we finally get to that part of the conversation. We'll also be meeting on next week the task force that's looking at housing production strategies. And we've been kind of talking about the first part of House Bill 2003, which is to creating an inventory for affordable housing needs. And then the second half will be what are some of those strategies that can be used to really encourage, incentivize, and permit the construction of more affordable housing. It's really, okay, you can talk about it, but how are you really going to make it happen? And what are the strategies you can put in place to make it happen? And Stephanie also serves on that committee. I don't know if you have any other perspectives on that.
Well, I guess I would say I think a lot of the strategies are similar to things that the city is exploring through the Housing Tools and Strategies project. So there's quite a bit of interconnection between those different elements. And we are always, trying to think about, well, how could we utilize or implement more strategies? I think another sort of aspect of this is a little bit of role of local government versus the state versus other entities. And so when we talk about housing production, as we sort of move into a role where the local government is playing a more active role, but a lot of the resources for housing production that the state provides are actually provided to Oregon Housing and Community Services. And so one of the questions that I have is, how do we sort of make some better interconnections between these different systems? Because if we really want to be able to advance strategies at the local level, we have to figure out how to connect it to the resources that are available to support housing production, particularly affordable housing production. And I think that's kind of the underlying part of this, which really is about the affordability, not just the overall housing production.
So could I just respond to this, just so you keep it in mind? I would not foresee the legislature ever not allocating the money to HCS.
Absolutely.
So you might want to have in the legislation some greater direction or some greater role somehow with HCS. But the legislature currently, and as long as Betsy Johnson is co-chair of Ways and Means, won't change, is really into measuring output. So they want accountability, and they've got control over HCS's budget, so they've got control there. They don't have control over your budget. or the City of Eugene's budget, so
Well,
that,
there
that
are-
part won't change.
I mean, there are cases where they are providing technical assistance
I
dollars
understand,
to
understand,
local
just-
government. So I would just sort of say, there's sort of, and this is not like one or the other. There's a lot of different places in between. But I think this is a little bit of what's happening at this point in time, is that there's a lot of emphasis on local responsibility. But there's a lot of limitations on the tools that local government actually has to get to the outcomes that they're asking for. And so, to me, my perspective is everybody needs to be at the table talking about how to get to those outcomes, not that it's going to result in a mass redirection of how the legislature allocates resources. Did you want to say something, Kristen?
I mean, I would just say that all of the funding sources that Oregon Housing is putting out right now are completely disconnected from this and are, really emphasizing really different housing types and are really impacting how we put projects together. So I would agree that there's a disconnect, and I don't know how to make that connection work, but I think it's worth talking about.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think you make the connection only through HCS. Margaret Salazar has a lot of influence. I know you're struggling and not getting anywhere, but that's probably the way it has to go.
Yeah. Well, this is
I
an
don't want that to be
active
in the minutes.
conversation, a lot of different local jurisdictions at the table, a lot of different housing advocates at the table. And I think the thing that everyone has in common is wanting to get to that outcome of more housing production and meeting more needs in communities. And so that part is definitely that there is a lot of good people, as Councilor Pryor said, around the table that are trying to figure out strategies for making this happen.
So one way to approach it would be through the Housing Stability Council, and one of the 7 members of the Housing Stability Council is local, Professor Sandoval from U of O. He's new to that effort, so he has a lot to learn, but he seems open.
And he's actually an alternate on the rulemaking committee, so.
That's true.
Yeah. Yep.
I think I think it's a long-term effort, and the Housing Alliance is the other way to go. You're a member of that.
Yep. Yep.
Okay, Julia?
Well, as many of you know, I attended the Renters Protections Committee earlier, or last month. And I was wondering if there's an order of business where I'm supposed to be named, or if that was. No, I wasn't sure if the housing.
Did we?
if
Oh,
this
that's
board
right.
was
That,
supposed
thank
to-
you.
I was sort of
Thank
there
you for reminding me.
semi-officially, yeah.
So let's take on this piece of business right now. So the Housing Policy Board appoints the members of the Renters Protection Committee.
I move we appoint Julia.
And can I just be clear, we had a member step off of the
Right,
Renter Protections
right.
Committee, so we actually
Have an opening.
have an opening, yes.
Okay, I'll second that.
Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Done. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, I forgot. Okay, anything else from you,
No, that's all for this.
Bernice?
I am very sad to say that Ann Williams, a longtime staff person, long time, like over 28 years of St. Vincent de Paul, passed away last week. She was the first professional person that Terry had hired, and she created all of our housing programs. She also started our homeless services, and the thing that was really near and dear to her heart were the homeless veterans programs that she started in Lane County. So this just happened last week.
Yeah.
Her next of kin is in Vermont, and so we are trying to work with him on details, but in the future, we will have some sort of memorial for her, and I'll keep you posted on that.
Good.
And she was a national expert on housing services.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I couldn't share on the very first project I worked on at the city was the first veterans living independently following treatment process. And it was just definitely a huge heartfelt effort to try to figure out how do you bring together different sources of fundings that have never been brought together before to actually create a place for veterans coming out of homelessness. And I remember Anne speaking about her work just in the pre-counseling groups of kind of working with veterans who had been homeless for over 20 years and getting them to the place of being able to move into housing. So I always remember that about Anne, the passion that she brought to that work.
She was one stubborn character.
Yep. Jenna, anything? I'm sorry.
No.
So I included in your packet a flyer from the city of Springfield, which is really a good explanation of what is middle housing. And so I encourage you all to read it. I didn't put it in the package just to be put it upon. And I also included the memo long article from
It's from the New York Times. Bill.
This is Bill from the New York Times, yeah. Because I think of Eugene as a pretty liberal city in a lot of ways, but when it comes to housing, we are not even close. And the kinds of things they talk about in here are very similar to the problems we encounter in Eugene. And I want us to start thinking about how we can change that. And then,
So could I add that the author here of the New York Times piece has a longer version that's a book, and he is speaking at Powell's in Portland on next Monday.
and I decided not to enclose the book. And then, an article about what Tigard is doing, and damn, I'm embarrassed. They are really, really doing it. And Tigard is pro-housing, and that goes through the councilors, planning commission, residents, everybody. And we need to move in that direction. So I'm going to encourage us to have more conversations on this to see how we can bring some influence on you guys, among others.
I just wanted to highlight one thing that I thought was really interesting about the Springfield piece, which is when they point out that historically duplexes, triplexes, and small housing units were allowed and built alongside single unit homes in neighborhoods, and how important I think it is for Eugene and Springfield, but obviously Springfield's ahead of us, to recognize that mixed housing is much more a part of our historic past, and that our single-family home obsession is very recent. It really is only since the Second World War, and I think the more people realize that that's an anomaly, that it will be easier to get people to shift back. So I don't know the extent to which this historic duplex, triplex is also characteristic of Eugene, but if it is, I think it's something that should be coming into every single conversation about middle housing.
So you're pointing out how important the way we talk about things is.
Yes.
And in the university world, that would be called framing an issue, how you frame an issue.
Yeah, that's what I usually call
And
it.
Karin, when she spoke to us in February, talked about how the headlines on HB 2001 have all been about versions of the legislature is making single-family housing illegal. She said, no, what it's doing is re-legalizing the housing that we used to allow before the 40s and 50s. That's when it started to change.
Right, and I was just emphasizing that I felt it was very valuable that that was mentioned specifically in this flyer and the importance of that in the conversation. So.
I live in an older neighborhood that was built before the 50s, and for the 60s anyway, and it's full of duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, apartments.
The building I live in was built in 1921. Okay, so I want to have us continue this conversation a little bit anyway every month. Staff.
Yes. So a couple of different updates. I'm going to talk in a little bit about the consolidated plan, but this time of year is also the time of year where we start working on our one-year action plan for use of federal funds. And so then tomorrow, the Home Consortium Governing Board is meeting, and Ellen's going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment, to talk about the home allocation and other topics. We had the first meeting of our Community Development Block Grant Advisory Committee meeting last week on Thursday, and so Eugene has its own CDBG committee and Springfield has their own committee, and our next meeting is on March 11th, and we'll be discussing the draft allocation for use of CDBG funds at that meeting. And then the other item that I did want to mention is that council did approve the use of community development block grant funds for the city to purchase the old Lane Community College building for the development of housing. And so the proposed scope for this project is that it would be 51% of the units would be affordable to people earning 80% of area median income and below, and that the remaining units would be market rate units. And this is really an effort to try to explore different ways to try to bring what I would call kind of moderately affordable housing to the market using a more limited set of city subsidies and resources, and engaging with the private sector to try to get more private sector participants in creating this type of housing, which we also have a deficit of in our community, in addition to housing for people with very limited incomes. So council voted 8-0 to move forward with that. And so we're continuing to move through the different regulatory compliance pieces, and hopefully we'll be purchasing the building by April, and then issuing a request for proposals to interested parties. And again, this is something that is experimental, and we'll see what comes out of it, but it's a desire to be able to kind of put forward a property and hopefully get a significant number of units on that property.
Is the expectation that the building would be torn down or that it would be rehabbed to be?
It is likely that the building will be replaced. The current building has a significant amount of lead and asbestos, and it also really limits the number of units that you could create.
It's really not, it was a department store, it's not good for apartment housing.
Yeah, yeah.
And is the expectation that there would be additional city subsidy for the affordable units?
So we're gonna be working through what the package of resources will be. Demolishing the building is quite costly, and so I mean this is a very constrained urban site, and so it's definitely a bit of a development challenge. So we're talking about, well, what are the package of resources that would come together to support it.
And did this proposed purchase, eat up all the money available for land banking?
We use the money that has currently been allocated, and so we'll be going through the allocation
Oh, but not the new
process.
allocation.
Right,
Tomorrow,
right.
yeah.
This is money that was previously
Right, I know there's a
allocated
pile of
by
money there,
council.
yeah.
I will also say that this, I mean, before we proposed this site, we had investigated at least 2 or 3 other potential sites to purchase. So I think finding sites to purchase is definitely been a challenge for us.
That's a challenge, right?
Yeah, and so we continued to try to reach out to different partners who might be interested in selling land to the city for affordable housing development, and really, welcome any community members who might have an interest in selling land to please contact us.
So which location is?
This is the old Lane Community College building,
Across from
which
the bus
is
station.
on Willamette. It's right by
Okay, yep,
the
I
bus
know.
station.
Yep.
It's actually an L-shaped lot,
Right.
and so the building fronts both on Willamette and on 11th.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, anything else from you?
Those are the main items for me. Other staff may have items.
I'll just give a quick update, just to follow up from the meeting, from last month's meeting and the request for videotaping.
Yeah.
We're not there yet, but we are, we have an inquiry in to see if we can post the recorded meetings online. So hopefully we'll have
The
an
audio
answer.
recording.
Right, yeah.
Okay, good.
In addition to the minutes, the audio recording. So
Okay.
Keep you posted.
Thanks for continuing to pursue that.
Keep after it.
Ellen?
Yes. I just wanted to provide you an update on the home allocation process, which you got a handout of the draft home allocation for next fiscal year. The Home Consortium Governing Board is meeting tomorrow afternoon at 3:30 here in this room to potentially adopt this as the draft allocation. And there would be a 30-day public comment period and a public hearing at their April meeting, which is April 7th at 3:30 in this room. So anyone is welcome to make comments. This separation of the annual entitlement allocation from HUD is all set forth in the Eugene-Springfield Intergovernmental Agreement. So it's pretty much set by percentage every year in the same way. So there's not that much variation from year to year. 85% of the funds are used for home projects, development projects, and 5% of the funds are used for CHODO operating grants. And CHODOs are community housing development organizations, a special designation of certain nonprofits. And then 10% is used for administration of the programs. So this year, the only difference is that we're getting a repayment of a loan that was provided to Market District Commons, a short-term construction loan. And so those funds will be coming back and used for housing development and a little bit for administration. And that will be included in the 2020 RFP later in the fall. So that's the only unusual thing this year for the home allocation. Does anyone have any questions about home allocation?
How does the 1.2 million allocation compare to last year?
It's up 5%. I also wanted to just give a brief update about the Homes for Good projects since nobody from Homes for Good is here today. They did close on their financing for the RAD 2 project, which is a 2-site development, Taney Place in Eugene, 49 units, and Hayden Bridge Meadows in Springfield is 70 units. And those 2 projects, the Springfield one received some home funds, but it's part of the rental assistance demonstration project that actually Ty referred to earlier. That involves selling some of their scattered site, well, all of their scattered site houses, and those rental subsidies would be transferred into these new rental housing complexes so that most of the units would be, people could earn up to 50% of area median income, but they would only be paying 30% of their income for rent. So they could actually earn $0 a month and still be able to live there. And their whole rent would be covered by rental subsidy. And then Commons on MLK is under construction, and that's the permanent supportive housing project across from Monson Stadium. And Market District Commons, if you haven't been by there recently in downtown across from the Graduate Hotel, it's going up quickly, and that's expected to be complete in the fall, and Commons on MLK is expected to be complete maybe by the end of this year. So I think if there's a groundbreaking ceremony for Taney Place, that we'll send it out to everyone. That hasn't been announced yet, but they have picked up their building permits, so that should be coming out soon.
You advanced the number of units of the two commons.
At the Commons on MLK, it's 51 units of permanent supportive housing, and Market District Commons is 50 units with first floor commercial. Any questions about those? Thank you.
I did just want to comment on, respond a little bit to Todd's comment about the rationale for scattered site, for selling scattered site housing. And certainly, I think Steve could share more at the following meeting. But I think from a kind of long-term sustainability perspective, caring for scattered site public housing is very costly. And with the goal of trying to keep rents low over time, being able to take that portfolio and basically have multifamily housing is going to be more sustainable. Homes for Good has also worked closely with Dev Northwest to try to help the current occupants of those units to be in a position where they could purchase those units as their homes. So they're also trying to create an affordable homeownership opportunity as part of this project for the current residents. And of course, for all the residents, they have to be able to provide the choice for them to move into one of the new units if that is what they want to do. So there's a lot of safeguards in this process, but ultimately the goal is to try to create a more sustainable portfolio for Homes for Good so that they can continue to provide housing at low rents.
Okay, anybody else from staff? So just a process check, we're 15 to 20 minutes behind on the agenda. So everybody who has something to cover, keep that in mind. In terms of project updates, Emily couldn't come, but she gave me some notes. Cottage Grove, we're under construction of 6 community land trust homes. I won't go through the details on that. Florence received approval for a PUD from the Planning Commission. We'll begin excavation on this 12 community land trust units. In Eugene, we're in pre-development on a 9-acre parcel off Royal Avenue, across from Prairie Mountain School. Some has wetlands, etc. Planning 31 single-family community. What did I say? Planning 31 single-family community land trust homes.
Where is this parcel?
Across from the Prairie Mountain School.
Out of Bethel.
Royal Ave.
Royal Avenue. So she gave me some extended notes, and I'll get them in the minutes. Okay. We don't have anybody from Housing Authority here.
Well, I think Ellen just gave you that.
Yeah, that's right.
Home Tribune report.
Okay. And St. Vincent's?
So I have been working on what we're calling the River Road Affordable Housing, which the neighbors have named Iris Place. So I think I updated in December that we submitted for building permits. We are working diligently with all the attorneys now and have documents going back and forth. Our aim is to close the financing April 15th and start construction May 1st. We'll see if that happens. We have been meeting with our 3-person neighborhood engagement team, meeting on pretty much a monthly basis, and we're presenting to the larger neighborhood group next Monday night to give them an update on the project. Let's see, and then Terry gave me a brief update to share on the Dusk to Dawn program, because he thought it was important. So that is our homeless camping site at 717 Highway 99. This year we've had 256 spaces, and this past weekend, for the first time ever, we have 40 empty spaces. So we've had a year and a half where there's been a waiting list. And we have entered into a partnership with Willamette Treatment to provide drug and alcohol and medical services on that site, and that will be operational later this month. And he has been working on trying to develop a modular unit that would be either a quad or a quint to be able to put on that site as transitional housing, or there are some people in the Dusk to Dawn program that could use interim transitional housing, so they are getting closer on that.
Any sense of progress on finding a site for a new manufactured home park in Springfield?
He started to talk about that, and I said,
No.
I don't want to go there, but he said, if anyone has questions, you can call him.
Okay, thanks. That's it for you?
Yeah, it's proven to be a lot harder to find an appropriate site.
It always is.
Yeah.
Okay, I think that's all for that. Con plan?
Yes. So I went to council on February 27th, I believe, to discuss the draft needs and strategies with city council. And so we had a good but fairly brief discussion about these issues. And so I wanted to just go ahead and share this presentation and quickly walk through it and answer any questions. I want to leave more time for questions, so I'm going to move forward through this very quickly. I will also say that the draft con plan is now up on the website. We just started the 30-day comment period today. And then there will be a hearing on April 1st in front of the Con Plan Advisory Committee. All of this information is on the website at this point in time. So just kind of moving through, I don't think we need to spend a lot of time kind of going through the scope of the Con Plan, because I've talked about this with this committee before. But I do think it would be useful just to kind of skip to the various ways in which we've engaged community members throughout this period. And so we've done outreach both at the kind of needs assessment stage, and then also as we're moving into the proposed needs and strategies. So in the fall, we did the community resident needs survey and the agency needs survey. And you can see the number of responses on the slide on page, it says page 5 at the bottom. We did a variety of consultations with boards, commissions, and agencies, just generally trying to get the word out, hearing people's perspectives on the consolidated plan needs. We then held a community open house on February 12th. We had over 130 community participants, and many of the people in this room came to that event. And that was where we shared the draft priority needs and strategies and got feedback from people. We asked everyone who came to fill out a strategy prioritization survey, and also made that available on the website. And so we received quite a few responses from that as well. And then, of course, we're working with the Consolidated Plan Advisory Committee. There is a great deal of data that is analyzed through the consolidated planning process, and really with an effort to try to bring together a complete picture from disparate sources. And so this year we've worked with a national consulting firm, the Cloudburst Group, who works with communities across the country to help them develop their consolidated plans. And so they have been very helpful in bringing together all of this information and also helping us to think through the strategies. When we look at our community profile, and the focus of this plan is both Eugene and Springfield, so you'll see in the report that there's a lot of data that looks at both communities together, but then also looks at each community separately to see what are the distinct issues and needs in each community. But for writ large, we're seeing moderate growth, a greater share of seniors. People age 65 and older now make up over 26% of the population. Greater diversity, slightly decreasing household size. Our median incomes are growing, but still lag behind the state and country. And we have very low unemployment at this point in time. As we look at the income and poverty indicators, these are fairly similar to what we've seen in the past, with some increases in the number of homeless people counted during the 2019 point in time count. As we move on, we also look at low-income areas, and there has been a little bit.
We don't have a 2020 point.
The 2020 point in time count just occurred.
January.
But in the end of January, but it usually takes several months.
So we don't know yet.
So we don't
tabulating
know,
it.
That's fine,
and
that's
we
fine.
won't know for this planning process,
Okay.
really.
2,000 people more than it is.
When we
Sense.
look at the low-income areas map, because this is an aspect of utilizing CDBG and home funds, is thinking about where you have areas where 51% of the population or more have incomes below 80% of area median income. We are seeing a little bit of shifts kind of out towards West Eugene in some of the data. Looking at renter households needs, we've talked about some of these statistics previously, seeing significant increase in median rental rate, in the percentage of renter households that have moderate or severe housing cost burdens. Also now a shift where Eugene renter households make up 51% of households. In Springfield, it's 49%. So they're fairly close to one another. As we look at owner housing needs, also seeing significant increases in home sales prices and seeing a significant number of owner households that have moderate or severe housing cost burdens, and especially significant issues among Eugene homeowners with low incomes. And so that is something that it's definitely not as significant as among renters, but it is a population that we have some concerns about. Yes?
Can I just jump in with a quick question that would be helpful? Is there a way to work out the household size for low-income renters?
We can ask. And so they're pretty good at telling us like if they can come to a subset of information.
Or even for renters in general, because I feel like what we're seeing is we need more 1s and 3 bedrooms.
Mhm.
It's like the low-income folks are either solo or have multiple kids. And then when this decreasing household size keeps being said over and over, it's like.
Right. Well, and I think that's a very important caveat, because this is like the average, so of course it's not going to reflect everyone. You're still going to have needs with larger households that need units
But that's
as well.
information that would be useful.
Yeah.
It would be useful for me, and it's useful too when we're writing grants and stuff, and when people have this concept that we have decreasing household size, they're asking why.
I think the American Survey gathers that information.
Yeah, and I mean, in the full con plan report, which is posted online, which is essentially a series of questions that HUD asks us and we have to provide the answers to. So it's not the smoothest reading document, but there is an enormous amount of data in it. So I would also encourage you to take a look at the full report, because there's a lot of good information. And I think, if there are questions about the data, now is a good time, because we can work with the consultants
That's a good
to
question.
try to see if it's possible to discern. I do just want to give the caveat that a lot of this is sample data, so it may not get to the level of granularity that people sometimes want. It's a rolling sample, so, yeah. Okay. All right. We also are looking at fair housing issues as part of this, and so there's multiple components of the analysis of impediments. And so there is definitely evidence that members of protected classes do sometimes experience housing discrimination. Looking at our complaint data over the past 5 years to Fair Housing Council of Oregon, people with disabilities submitted the greatest number of complaints. When we look at community surveys, people believe they've experienced housing over 20% of the time. We do not have any geographic areas that meet HUD's threshold for racially or ethnically concentrated areas of poverty. The areas that come the closest to that are actually right next to the university. And so just as a reminder, any student who's living off campus will show up as somebody who is living in poverty if they have a limited income. Looking at regulatory analysis, there are some areas where we could, regulations could be improved to better support fair housing goals. And there also was some analysis that found a limited number of mortgages were being made to some minority groups. Those findings are still being developed, and so they're not in the draft documents that are available. And so I did just want to mention that. So taking all of this together, the proposed priority needs, we looked, we did quite a significant reorganization in 2015. We looked at that organization of priority needs with the consultants and felt with some minor modifications in what's included that the same categories made sense for organizing the work of the consolidated plan. Move on. I'm going to skip past basic background information about CDBG and home. The one thing that I will say is, for home, the one and only focus of home is creating affordable housing. It does target a lower income range than CDBG. CDBG allows up to 80% of area median income for housing. And also you can qualify projects and non-housing projects in other ways. So when we look at the proposed strategies, these are very similar to what we did 5 years ago. Again, the con plan creates the menu, and you're really basically kind of trying to create categories that projects would fit into, as opposed to kind of very specifically saying we're going to do X or Y. We had some examples of how we put together different kinds of resources, both state and local resources, to support different kinds of projects, including permanent supportive housing, Iris Place, which is kind of more along the lines of a family development, and then Polk Street Apartments, which is a special needs project that was supported to create housing for youth aging out of foster care. And then the next set of strategies are the community development strategies, which focus on human service operations and facilities, which does include emergency housing and shelter, and then business loans, and making strategic investments in low-income neighborhoods. And there's also some examples of how we've utilized CDBG funds to support day access centers, resource centers, and transitional housing for homeless people. And then in terms of the fair housing strategies, this is really the range of the types of solutions that we're exploring. There is just an overall recognition that people who are members of protected classes have more limited incomes. And so expanding the supply of affordable housing is not just an affordable housing strategy, it's also a fair housing strategy. And so we want to recognize that. Also, our land acquisition program has played a very critical role in avoiding concentrations of poverty throughout the community, because we have played this role in terms of trying to place affordable housing in many different places and parts of the community. And I would add that the density bonus that we have through the controlled income and rent program has also been a very critical tool for creating that housing. The fair housing outreach and education, thinking about how are ways that we can expand or reach different groups of people. Renter protections obviously works and connects very closely to this work, and exploring regulatory changes. So I'm going to stop there and take questions and comments.
I'd be curious to see the regulations that were identified as barriers for fair housing.
Yeah. And we will come back and talk about those in a much more specific way. Any other questions or comments? Right. So in terms of next steps, March 2nd, today, we published the draft executive summary, the entire consolidated plan for a 30-day comment period. April 1st, we'll hold the Conclave Advisory Committee, which is composed of representatives from both Eugene and Springfield, and that's where we'll hold the public hearing. And then on April 27th, Eugene City Council will have an opportunity to adopt the consolidated plan as well as the one-year action plan. For the first year, those are submitted together to HUD, and then in subsequent years, you just submit the action plan, and then Springfield City Council will meet on the same day. The entire consolidated plan and action plan is due to HUD on May 15th.
All right. Thank you for the synopsis. Shall we move on? Legislative agenda?
That's me. The fact that Ethan Nelson and I are both in this room instead of in the Capitol probably tells you that the Republicans are not back. At least they were not back as of 10 this morning. And I haven't heard anything else to that effect. So by our Constitution, the special session must end on or before Sunday, March 8 at midnight. The thinking seems to be that everything has moved along appropriately, except for cap and trade, the cap and trade bill, which prompted the Republicans to walk out of both houses. But everything else has moved along appropriately, working its way through the relevant committees, and I mean, there's still a
Committees
couple.
continue to meet.
Committees continue to meet because they meet on a simple majority. And since the Democrats control the majority of both houses, there's a majority of committee members still present. So, I mean, for example, a couple of the bills that I'll mention had hearings last week in Ways and Means, the subcommittee and then the full committee. And at that level, there really isn't much discussion other than Betsy Johnson repeatedly saying, I want to see output. I want to see results. So, which is why I brought it up, because she keeps bringing it up every bill. Outcomes, I guess I should say. Results, she wants to say.
Results.
There's plenty of money to be spent. The fiscal state of the state is good. Some of the things that we would care about would be in the funding package at the end, the budget adjustments. And I haven't seen any real progress on those. But there are other bills that have money. One of the more important ones is House Bill 4001, which is the Speaker's bill to put something like $45 million into expanded or new homeless shelters for next winter. As part of that, the bill would create quote, navigation centers, would fund navigation centers in Eugene, Salem, McMinnville, Medford, and Bend.
Not Portland?
Portland already has one.
Oh, okay.
And so for Eugene, for example, would get $5 million. Now, that's a one-time allocation, and so you're gonna have to figure out, and the Speaker keeps saying that you'd have to figure out funding going forward. But that's a significant investment.
Significant.
On her part, and the legislature's part, and that's.
That's the zoning piece too.
The second part of that is the zoning piece, which the cities seem to have calmed down a bit about. And that is a supersiting, sort of a supersiting in which a city would have to approve an emergency shelter proposal. Although what the cities have forced the Speaker to do is to add increasing restrictions on who might qualify to do that supersiting. There was some concern about shelters outside of UGBs. No, they have to be inside UGBs. Some concern about whether some sort of fly-by-night person could claim to be a shelter. So now it's requiring a certain amount of experience, a 501c3. So it looks like it's going to be the usual St. Vincent de Paul kind of proposals. So that's House Bill 4001. House Bill 4015 has a small fix to 2019's HB 2003, the Housing Needs Assessment Bill, to deal with assessments required within the metro area around Portland that we don't care about. But the other big part of that is an expansion of an ADU pilot program, which is already underway in Portland with funding locally in Portland for 10 units, in which 5 nonprofits led by Hacienda are finding 10 homeowners who are willing to build, with assistance, an ADU on their land. And then they will either rent out that ADU as an income source for them, or move into the ADU and rent out the house. And so it's not really low-income housing, but it's meant to be encourage infill and show the role of ADUs in helping low-income people have home ownership. And the concept is to test that pilot outside of Portland. And although Emily Ryman keeps saying that Deb Northwest is named as one of them, I can't find that in the bill. So there must be a secret handshake deal with Housing and Community Services. But there will be pilots outside of Portland, and our area, Springfield, I think, will be one. I think Medford will be one, Bend will be one. But again, that's not in the bill, so I think that must be an agreement with Housing and Community Services. So that's House Bill 4015. Senate Bill 1531 is sort of an omnibus tax fix bill. It's meant not to be controversial. Has a lot of stuff in it. 22 different changes to different tax things, most of them mundane. But one of them has to do with the property tax exemptions that we use. The City of Eugene and Springfield now use. ORS 307.515. That will be changed in 2 ways in this bill. And this bill's already passed the Senate. So if the House Republicans would come back, we could pass it. But that bill, that change is to allow, not require, but allow cities 2 additional options in granting an affordable housing property tax exemption. The first is to do something that's already allowed in the other tax exemption program that Portland uses, and that is that the city could allow occupants' income to increase above the initial 60% of median income to 80% after the first year of occupancy. So if their incomes increase, they don't automatically get booted out. The second change is to allow something called income averaging for tax credit projects. Federal tax credit projects, the incomes to be eligible have to be 60% or less. The Congress changed that to allow up to 80% as long as the average of all units is 60% or less. So it's kind of like an internal subsidy you could have. You could get to some very low income units if by allowing some 80% income units. And
So
that
this
was
is just putting us in compliance with the new federal law.
Yeah, we don't have to comply. It's the HCS is already allowing that. HCS allocates the tax credits, and it's already allowing that for pure tax credit projects. But you couldn't combine that with the property tax exemption, because the property tax exemption that Eugene uses doesn't allow up to 80% of median income. So the statute will say Eugene can do, cities that adopt 307.515 could use income averaging. So that's the main part of that 1531. Another bill is 1535, Senate Bill 1535. It would, and it was sought on behalf of Labor and Industries Commissioner, not Bowley, but Labor and Industries Commissioner Val Hoyle, to make Oregon fair housing enforcement procedure law equivalent to federal law. And that the significance of that is that fair housing complaints can be enforced by Bowley. I'm sorry, I shouldn't, because Val does not want to call it Bowley instead of by HUD. So instead of having to go to HUD to enforce a complaint, you can go to Salem or Portland. Oregon Labor and Industries offices, main offices in Portland. There's a couple of other ones. There's lift and preservation money for new development, a whole bunch. I think 50 million each. But those sorts of deals get cut at the end of the session. There's there's a funding program, an experimental pilot program to fund SDCs in rural communities. I think it's like $500,000. There's House Bill 4002 is a study on whether or what it would cost and how one might run it. A state Section 8 voucher rent assistance program, which would, I think, be pretty costly. So I think the thinking seems to be that if the Rs come back, they can run all these things in 1 to 2 days. But we don't know if they'll come back. Oh, there's also the bill that I won't get Isaac in further trouble by making him describe it. The governor introduced a bill to do a referral to the voters in November to amend the Oregon Constitution, to amend the prohibition on real estate transfer taxes that the realtors got adopted in 2012, and with the limitation that an RATT could only be adopted by the legislature with the money dedicated to affordable housing. So I haven't seen that. That had one hearing, and I haven't seen it pop up anywhere else.
Any questions for John?
Anything to add?
Okay.
Ethan, do you want to add anything?
All right, last item on the agenda.
Affordable Housing Trust Fund Advisory Committee update. So we had our advisory committee meeting last week. We had a presentation remotely from Lynn McConnell from City of Bend, talking about their process and history with utilizing their construction excise tax, which people may know they've had a long-standing program that actually was created prior to the statewide preemption on CETs that was in place for many years, but has been repealed essentially. And so it's been useful just to kind of hear their perspectives. They essentially kind of run a combined process with their CDBG dollars for different proposals in their process. And really, I think they're pretty focused on creating an RFP that brings forward proposals from the community and for a variety of different uses, with a significant focus, I would say, on new development, as well as some homebuyer assistance. I did not hear a lot of discussion about rent assistance in the conversation. Isaac, do you want to add anything that kind of stood out for you from the conversation with Lynn?
Yeah, I thought it was fascinating to see an up and running CET that's functioning in the state of Oregon with our same laws. So I thought that there was a lot of ideas and things to unpack there. I was struck by how streamlined the system was. Like they had a very quick proposal and then going to the committee in order to make recommendations. And so it seemed to go very quickly on that. And so it was a great proposal, and those aren't filmed, are they? We don't have those. It was very worthwhile, and I think I still need to go back through my notes to look at that. But I thought that it was very interesting, and also the amount of, I think, having a goal. They had a goal of 100 houses per year that they would be affecting with that the CET funds, and so it gave them something to shoot for, and they got to that number through a variety of different metrics,
It's actually their CET and CDBG.
Oh, it is. Yeah. Okay. Gotcha.
It's a combined goal.
So combined
Yes.
goal, and so I think it's kind of an aspirational thing that they said that their goal is to hit 100 per year, and sometimes they might be 95, and then the next year might be 105, but to be able to hit those goals was a really interesting thing, and I thought it was nice and easy to understand for a community. And so I think one of the things hopefully we can do is show our community that we're being very responsible with the CET funds that we're pulling from our construction. And so I think that would be very helpful as we go through that process to kind of set up some goals. So it was a great lot of takeaways.
And, the City of Bend, they don't receive federal home funds, and so there's quite a few kind of parallels between their housing RFP process and the housing RFP process that we use for home funds. So I think really, you know, our goal as staff is kind of taking experiences from other places, our own experiences, and then using that to essentially kind of craft a set of strategies that we would use in the housing RFP process for the Affordable Housing Trust Fund dollars, which, you know, I just want to sort of keep reminding folks, part of that is a general fund dedication and part of that is the CET dollars. So the other part, we did have some discussion about the current revenue, and I can bring a complete update to the next meeting. But at this point in time, we have the $500,000 in general fund that council committed through supplemental budget number 1, and just about $200,000 that have accumulated through the construction excise tax. And so we're anticipating close to $900,000 by the end of the year. And
End of the calendar year?
end of the
Fiscal
fiscal
year.
year.
Fiscal year.
Good question. And so as we get ready to take a proposed allocation to council, which is going to happen on April 13th, we're using that as a rough budgeting figure. So the next meeting of the Affordable Housing Trust Fund Advisory Committee is going to take place at the end of March, and we haven't quite settled on a date yet, right, Teresa?
Correct.
But really what we're planning to do is an allocation model where we're saying this much for housing development, this much for renter assistance, this much for home buyer assistance, which are the categories that council we've talked about with council during the July council work session meeting.
I would say that the council's already weighed in on what they like in terms of the use of the money. And, you know, we've already spent this money 3 times over. So they're saying, I like this category, but it's not based on a lot of data or a lot of information, it's kind of a gut reaction. So it's going to be very important that the committee's recommendations and advice be used to help think through that again to see if those are still the best uses for a limited amount of money. And Bend, fortunately, has been doing this for a number of years. And so they have learned through experience what works, what doesn't work, what works better than other things. And in my last conversation with the Bend people, one of the things they said that was really critical to the success of their program was to be able to provide low-cost land, which we don't have a lot of here. We had land bank sites, but we're down to like our last one now. And the ability for Bend to leverage no cost to low cost land was an absolute critical element in them being able to provide affordable housing. That's a real restriction for us because we're struggling to find affordable land. And they're also, another thing they did was they took their revenue and they leveraged it strongly with the private sector so that they could find incentives to help private developers to build affordable housing, which is really not in their wheelhouse because they can't make a pencil out. So that's some of the things that have worked well for them, but they're not necessarily on Eugene's radar yet because we have no experience with them.
So I have a few comments. One, Isaac mentioned how smoothly and quickly and efficaciously the process works over there. I think that's assisted by the fact that their committee has a lot of individual expertise that our committee does not have. And so our committee is going to be relying more on staff because they don't have the expertise on the committee members themselves. One of the big takeaways for me was that for their development money, it's all done as loans.
Yes.
I mean, that was
Great point.
I mean,
The account.
right. I mean, and they've got a schedule. You know, if it's this kind of housing, you have to pay it back over 50 years. So this kind of schedule, this kind of property, you do it thus and such. And they're at the point, because they've been doing it for 10 years, where those repayments are a significant source of income for them. So that's something we need to consider.
So they are required repayments, or they're forgiven for
requires. Well, no, some of them for shelters are, you know, no payments and we'll review it in 10 years or something.
Yeah, it's very flexible.
Yeah, I mean, I think they have definitely used the loan model, and, you know, and we've used that in some cases
Right.
and for some projects. I think one thing also just, I always sort of try to caution folks when we're looking at comparisons with other places is, like Bend's median income is $69,000. So 100% of area median income in Bend is not the same as 100% of area median income in Eugene.
What's our median?
Our median is, let's see.
48, right around
48, 47.
48?
So it's quite a significant difference. And, you know, and again, when you're looking at models from the Portland area median income is much, much higher than here. And we've traditionally been trying to pursue much, much lower income projects here. And I mean, do you want to add anything?
Well, I mean, it's somewhat analogous, but, you know, one of the tools that's out there are the LIFT funds, and all over the state, people are talking about LIFT and 4% dollars. And in talking to investors, they said that when I was talking to investors about the River Road project, they said that they would have some pretty big hesitation in doing a 4% LIFT project in Eugene, whereas they do them all the time in other areas. So because our incomes are so much lower, just because there are tools out there doesn't mean that
We can use them.
use them.
Yeah, different places, different factors.
So, I mean, in all of these cases, we're taking these best practices, considering our local community context, considering how could we apply them and utilize them in a way that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I would just add that our home evaluation committee is composed of people with real estate expertise, and so that is actually something we do already with our home housing RFP. It's different. The Affordable Housing Trust Fund Advisory Committee is not just dealing with housing development, but renter assistance, homebuyer assistance. So that's going to be a very broad group. We may decide when it comes to reviewing the specific housing development RFPs that you have a subset of that group.
Or a different
Because
group.
we have some people on that group that are more interested in renter assistance, more interested in homebuyer assistance, which are all very different worlds from housing
I know it's a work in
development.
progress.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the staff had projected a certain amount of income from our CET. Is there any way to compare the projection with actual results?
Well,
So far? I know it's early, but.
my comment is that there's very little commercial CET proceeds, because guess what? You know, before the thing was adopted, there was a flood of permitting.
Yeah.
And so I seen that bubble in the first year.
It's
I
gonna
think it was-
stabilize.
And that happened in Portland.
Well,
Yeah.
and just recognize for the purposes of the definition for calculating affordable housing trust fund dollars, residential is all multifamily. So it doesn't follow, like, our building code would call multifamily commercial.
Correct.
But for the purposes of calculating the CET, it's in that residential bucket.
Right.
So I mean, yes, you could say there's other commercial, but it's not, I mean, I think we have not seen a significant slowdown in residential development as a result of this.
Right.
But you didn't answer my question. Did we project it at a certain amount? Are we anywhere near that actual?
So
Do know that?
we never did actual projections. We did our sort of rear view analysis and said, if you had applied the CET in these years at these amounts, this is what you would.
And over the
would have
last several
gotten.
years, it was $1 million a year, but that
It
was
was about $1 million.
but that was at 1%.
I would have to look back at the specific projections, because I think we projected it at, or looked at it at 0.5% and 1%. I don't think we actually did one for 0.33, which is where we are right now.
Right.
So, yeah.
So, and then just as a fun note, which I would not like to be in the minutes, the reason Bend has more sites than we do is because their UGB was way big and they didn't do infill.
Yeah.
And when I was on LCDC 10 years ago, we rejected 2 times in a row their UGB expansion proposals because they weren't doing infill. So that's going to change over time.
Yeah.
I mean,
Every conditions are different.
I mean, I will say, you know, with the LCC project, I mean, we will have developed over 1,000 units through the land acquisition for housing program. And so it's definitely been but finding new sites for it is the challenge.
New
So we
sites
have
is
we
tough.
have a great history. We need to find more sites.
We absolutely do.
Yeah.
Okay, 1:30. Anybody else? Before we go to the order, then we are adjourned.
Oh, your new product, no, I'm just teasing.